I give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it? Right. So this is the thing that happens in the background that's fun. And if you're coming on and you're seeing us laughing, because we start getting into these really good conversations about things. And then we're like, oh, wait, we need to record. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about this right now. So you're coming in on the here, push the record button.
Yeah.
And yeah, in this episode previous to this conversation, we were really talking about this letter that came out that had a really huge impact, depending on what side of regardless of where you stand, it just has an impact of dehumanizing the value of human life and people across our globe. And so a part of that conversation, like returning to what's going on in US territory, and people come to their understanding where they're educated and how they're educated, right? Like the foundational components of what you learn, what you think, where the values are placed, that's where it comes. And in the US, we have a set of premier institutions. We call them the Ivy Leagues out there, and that's a group of schools that were erected as the United States was forming itself and becoming the United States. And so the oldest university was King's College, and then it became Columbia University. So most folks today in present day life know King's College as Columbia University. It's in the city of New York, right there on 116th. And I speak and say this, and I can speak and say this because I am alumni. I never really actually tell people that, but I am alumni, so I am legitimate to be able to speak on this issue and to be able to speak on what it was.
Yes.
To be on that campus. To be on that campus. And when I was on that campus as a young Black identified female, it was a struggle. I had a very, very difficult time. I'm happy to have the history of that education and those letters behind, because it does open doors and move people. That's the reality of what it is. But the experience that I had on that campus, and a lot of my colleagues who are well known in community had a specific experience on that campus. And there's a history of experience of things going on Columbia University campus as the oldest, educational institution
Been around
in the
a long
United
time.
States. Been around. I always joke that alma mater at Columbia University is actually alma mater. So when we talk about the oldest university, we really are talking about a staple for understanding. And so you got all kinds of crazy stuff that eugenics, that pseudoscience came out of Columbia, and all people were believing it because it came out of Columbia, and a whole bunch of things. So it is to challenge and question even the things that we believe or uphold in the highest of spaces. And right now, Columbia is having a challenge dealing with the Trump administration, and all educational institutions are having a challenge. Well, a challenge, if I'm saying it's a challenge, if you want your education to be full, truthful, honest, and complete. If you don't, then there's not a challenge. But if you do, education, it actually means to bring forth knowledge rather than the way that we do education, which is kind of like programming. And at one time, I believe that Columbia might have been in the energy of bringing forth knowledge and sharing that knowledge with the world. How that's being done needs to be challenged and needs to be reflected upon, especially in this day and age when governance is trying to control what that looks like under the guise of creating safety. And when we're talking about creating safety, my hope is that, again, we go back to the ecosystem of care, that we're trying to create safety for all people, and not just certain folks, but all people. And what does that look like? And we need to have a lot of conversations to be able to do that. So thank you, Diane, for bringing this to the forefront and offering the challenge and saying, yo, okay, as alumni, let's talk about what's going on.
We based this off of a Instagram post that I found that was posted by Professor Catherine Franke. She's a retired professor from the School of Law at Columbia. And she was talking about an agreement that Columbia had come to with the federal government that would essentially make them a subsidiary. Her word was subsidiary of the federal government in terms of our U.S. government having oversight on who Columbia, accepts into their programs, what they teach, what is allowed to be spoken about, what is allowed to be protested about, all of the things. And we know that Columbia has been at the forefront with pro-Palestinian encampments. They were, I think, one of the first student bodies that created an encampment on their university campus, and Columbia failed to support and protect their pro-Palestinian students and called the New York Police Department on their encampments, and their students were brutalized by the New York police on several occasions as the encampments were being taken out. And I know when we were talking about this, Jay, you went and looked at your most recent email of around the time that this retired professor posted this video. I'd be curious to say, because you read the email to me, and I thought it was really interesting. Some of the statements that were made in the email seemed to point directly to which part of their student body they were so fervently trying to protect. So I'm curious
Okay.
what you thought
So
there.
one of the things that I was saying is that I haven't been on Columbia campus in decades. I'm going to say that, but not tell you how many.
Yeah, got to keep that clear. We don't need to know
Gotta
how
keep that,
many
that's
decades.
not, that doesn't,
It was a while
um,
ago.
not so long.
You were fine.
Um,
No.
eh, one of the things that I can say in my experience, I love to speak from centering my space, is that when I was there at Columbia, we used to joke around, and I don't really know the statistical demographics, but it was extremely high that most people were people of Jewish faith. I would say in the 90 percentile of
Okay.
folks that were are part of the student body when I was there. It's about 90 percentile of folks of Jewish faith and belief. If that has continued throughout the years, then I want to name that as a reality, that a large demographic of the student population at Columbia is going to be of Jewish faith, and in New York City there's a huge folk of Jewish faith population. You have a variety of folks. If you're there hanging out, you have from the Hasidic Jews, who are the more like Orthodox and have the curls and wear the clothes. In Brooklyn, there's a whole community, but a whole, like, all over the place. And so
Hmm.
there's a significant population of folks that move with the same understanding and ideology. And that is a reality on Columbia campus. And so when we're talking about safety on Columbia campus, and we're talking about where the focus might be,
Hmm.
it does make sense that with a large population of folks, that it then the science, the research, it's a research and teaching institution. The science and the research that's the demographic of people that you're going to be dealing with, because
Right.
that's the largest part of the population. So I wanted to name that. But
Hmm.
now that we have to do the research and look at what the demographic of students, and I don't even know if they ask religion questions nowadays.
I'm on the
Like when
right
you're
now looking for
applying to say how many folks are, Christians, Jewish, whatever the case may be. But the acting president stated that Columbia was basically, because I'm not going to read the whole email, but basically Columbia was going to stay true to its mission, that a part of that in the culture of Columbia is to be in relationship with whomever, and to have conversations about what would help Columbia get to the best and most effective place structurally to operate. The focus is going to be students, faculty, and the environment of Columbia. But they are going to continue to entertain, because money is on the table and capitalism controls all things right now,
yeah.
y'all. So that being the reality, I think it's $400 million on the table for research to have work done. What is what is important about that? Going back to the whole eugenics component of the history of Columbia University. And I'm focusing on that, but there's a whole lot of women's health things. There's a whole lot of other things that you can look at that might have come out of a premier institution that we need to check in with. When the government has oversight on what they are supporting as far as research dollars, that does not allow for you to have a diverse, like a what you need in research, and that is to run experiments,
Hmm.
to check on those experiments, by doing additional, to be able to repeat, to make sure that you're coming up with a theory. And a theory, again, is not fact, it's a theory, but
Right.
that you're trying to prove. So we have to be thinking about those things. And when you limit what research and who can do the research, because one person's mind about what it is that you're trying to have an answer to and understanding is going to be completely different than another person's. And
Yeah.
that is what I was talking about when I'm talking about my experience on Columbia University campus. Always very aggressive, because I'm hearing that this is the thing. We wrote the books, we know the information. And I'm like, in my community, in my household, that's not real. So you
Mhm.
can't tell me that this is the thing, but your focus was only in one place, so
Right.
that you didn't even have an understanding or a consideration that somebody else might have a different experience. And so that is where the challenge was. And that is what I spent 4 years mostly challenging the whole time, me and my colleagues. And wonderfully, I mean, I know we were challenging what the core curriculum was at the time, saying that these are the thought leaders that we only can learn from, and that being a very narrow group of white males that were giving us information when there's a plethora of other people that have great knowledge. So those are what I was talking about to check on. But yeah, so Columbia is at this space, and most institutions, most education in the United States is really at this place where, are we going to continue with the history of what we were doing, or are we going to really turn education into what it should be? And that is to bring forth knowledge, and to bring forth knowledge from a huge diversity of people, so that from there, and AI is helping us to do that. So I appreciate AI being able to aggregate a larger amount of data. Again, we got to make sure that that data is diverse and like kind of equitably, equally parsed out, so that we are getting the
Yeah.
most true, that less than 5% error in research.
Listening to you talk, it makes me think of, everything old is new again, right?
Mhm.
And it makes me think of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, what they did after the Civil War. And for those who don't know, they took control of the narrative. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, of course, is based in the southern regions of the U.S., and they took control of the narrative of why the Civil War was waged, why it was fought, that it was
Mhm.
about states' rights and not about slavery. And they infiltrated the
Education.
information that got put into the textbooks. The textbooks were being created in Texas and still are to this day. And they infiltrated the people that were writing the textbooks and made sure that the textbooks reflected this new narrative. I grew up in the South, and lived the majority of my life in the South. I'm now up in the North States, but there was always, they didn't call it the Civil War when I was growing up. It was called the War of Northern Aggression.
Mhm.
So just
Mhm.
that difference, not
Yeah.
calling it the Civil War, but calling it the War of Northern Aggression is a
Mhm.
narrative shift. And
Absolutely.
so that's what the UDC purposely did after the Civil War. And so me and you and everybody else that might be listening to the sound of my voice, and even generations before that, were taught a specific narrative about what led up to the Civil War, what happened during it, and what happened after, during Reconstruction and
Mhm.
beyond.
They call it something like, there's actually a name for having shifted the narrative of the South, to kind of
The Lost
glorify it.
Cause.
Yes, there it is.
Yeah,
There it is. The
yeah,
lost cause
yeah,
narrative. That
the
that is.
Lost Cause.
Thank you.
And that's why so many Southerners, and that's why there are narratives and thoughts and jokes and all kinds of things around the South, never thinking that we lost, because they literally changed the story about how it went down. And so when, coming back to our original topic for today's episode of why do we give a fuck about what's happening on Columbia campus and many other universities across this U.S. territory, we give a fuck because we've done this before.
You've
This
done
country
it.
has done this before, and probably more so even than the UDC and the textbooks, in terms of the narrative that we created after we stole this land from the indigenous. When my ancestors came over here and colonized this land, the narratives that we changed. I mean, the story about Thanksgiving, the pilgrims and the indigenous, the Indians coming together and loving each
Absolutely.
other, and all of that is bullshit. And so,
All of it.
so we've done this since the beginning of this country, since the beginning of our occupation here on Turtle Island. And so that's why we should care about this. That's why we give a fuck about what's happening now, because it's happening
Absolutely.
right in front of our faces, just as even maybe more so. I actually give a little less, I give more responsibility to those of us now who are living in this time, because back after the Civil War, when the UDC did it, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the globalization. We
Absolutely.
didn't have the only way you learned about something was years after it had happened, often because word just didn't travel fast enough. And so I kind of get how they were able in the shadows to infiltrate and do what they did
Do it.
without anybody really like being the wiser. But now there is no excuse. We are
There's
watching.
no excuse. And and it's being challenged differently, right? Because
Yeah.
every time something comes up, the actual truth of the matter, when you talk about the lost cause, and you're talking about changing the narrative, that also brings up a more current event that happened. There was one of the antebellum houses, one of the last standing
Yes.
antebellum houses that
In
burned down
Louisiana,
in
burned down to the ground.
down, down to the ground in was it in Indiana? Where was
Louisiana.
it?
Louisiana.
Louisiana. Okay.
Yeah.
And there's this smile like, okay, like it's burned down to the ground.
The
And
ancestors are
I
looking.
that was what my initial reaction was, like, yes, man, like I'm so glad this burned down, and folks were doing the rejoicing and all of that.
Uh-huh.
And then it hit me that that burning down means that we've lost yet another reminder and representation of
Mm.
the horrors that were occurring.
Mm-hmm.
And to have those places still erected as a part of our heritage, and the truth of the storytelling of them makes it more real and more tangible. So we lose a history, and now there is a different story and a different narrative when all of those stories are wiped out, or when those stories are never told, that actually gets to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
There is something about like Egypt and the entire world saying that we got most of our stuff out of Greece and Western civilization.
Right.
But when you go to Egypt, and when you look at the structures and you read the wall, if you can pay attention to the hieroglyphs and really understand the pictures, it's pictures, so you can understand them. Um, when you go and do that, there is and then there's also places in Egypt, I always go back to this, where the temples, where there was a story that was being told, and then whoever came and conquered, kind of, they did a sheet over that and then told a different story. So that
Yeah.
you wiped out what the history was. Um, and I'm very concerned about that on US territory. That if we do not have the relics, if we do not have the things that remind us of what was happening and it's wiped out, then they will change the story. They
Mm-hmm.
will talk about complacent, happy slaves on a plantation, because we don't hear any of the stories about all of the millions of slave revolts that happened, the
Yeah.
millions of folks that
Right.
were
Right.
murdered in their
Right.
houses because
Right.
they were tired of being abused and oppressed. And then
Right.
you don't hear a fight back. So then the narrative becomes, oh, this
They
is a
must have been
people that
happy. This is
will
how you.
allow this. Or you don't hear the fight back of all of the indigenous people in the United States that were like, I mean, you see the stories of cowboys and Indians, but you don't hear the people stories of the indigenous folks talking about their great grandparents, because it's only three generations back,
Yeah.
their
Right.
great grandparents, do you know what I mean, struggling and fighting against violence and oppression. Or if in right now Congo, in Palestine, if there is no replica, if there is no library, if there is no structure that is standing that speaks to the folks that have been holocausted, genocide,
Mm-hmm.
out of those spaces, then those who are in power get to then tell the narrative. And
Right.
that's what I fear, and that's what I have us to take, like, there's a rejoicing on, oh, okay, it burned down to the ground, but it also is a, we need to make sure that we are holding that history and never forgetting that history, so that we don't repeat that history, which is what we're doing.
I
Because
completely,
narratives were shifted
yeah,
before.
I completely agree and appreciate that reflection. I will say that, Whitney Plantation, which is also in Louisiana,
Mm,
is one of the few plantations that, forced labor camps that has the family that owns it now erected bronze statues, life-size
mm,
statues to depict the stories of what happened on those grounds.
love
And
it.
it is, I haven't been, it's on my bucket list.
Hmm.
And so the plantation that burned down in Louisiana a couple of weeks ago was one of those typical antebellum, uplifting the antebellum industrial complex kind of story. People got
Mm,
married there. It was, it's a forced
mm,
camp, but they're getting married there. Like would you go? I've been seeing memes. Would you go get married at Auschwitz? It
hmm,
really is
hmm,
the same thing.
hmm, hmm.
Full disclosure, I was going to get married on a plantation in Charleston for my second
Mm.
marriage, and we ended up eloping, and it didn't happen. But
Thing is that they're beautiful. The plantations
I
are
was going to do it, and I was going to
absolutely
do it under one of the
gorgeous.
biggest damn oak trees on the edge of the river, which is probably where people were lynched. I mean, I just want to
Absolutely.
say that out loud
You
because,
you can feel that when you go. You
yeah,
can definitely feel
I can
the
now.
history of it.
Did not
Hmm.
feel it back then. So,
Oh wow.
I
Okay.
am awake to that now.
That's a
No,
oh
I
really?
didn't. No, I didn't.
Okay.
I'm going to
Fair
be
enough.
honest. I didn't.
Yeah,
It was all
I
about the
hear you.
picturesque. I had totally bought the whole story. I had grown up with all of that and was not awake yet back then. So,
Mhm.
I will say in full disclosure, I am not telling
Yeah,
tales
man.
about other people. I was one of those people.
Yeah, I
So,
appreciate
so I said all that to say that this particular plantation, I completely support these spaces not disappearing because we don't want the stories to disappear. However, Whitney Plantation makes up for somewhere
it. For that one
in
going down.
Louisiana because it's telling the
You
real
don't need
story.
all of them.
It's telling the real story. And then there's
Yeah.
a slave labor camp in Charleston called McLeod Plantation. Shout out to McLeod. They're
Okay.
one of the few that tell the story about the enslaved, and they have the big house is open, but they don't do any tours in there. They don't talk about the people that owned
Mm,
it. They don't talk about all of they don't uplift that story and that narrative. They talk strictly about the enslaved. They call it a forced labor camp. It still says plantation on the sign, but any of the
mm.
interpreters, they call it a slave labor camp. So there are places that are trying to tell the real
Tell the
story,
truth.
to make
Yeah,
sure
man.
that's not. But you're right. Anytime anything goes away like that, it is another opportunity especially for stories that we're having to fight so hard to still keep in the
Keep.
lexicon,
Mm,
or that those so many of us are still haven't even learned. The Legacy
absolutely.
Museum, I want to do another shout out. The Legacy Museum in
Yeah.
Montgomery, Alabama, and the Peace and Justice Memorial just outside of Montgomery that Brian Stevenson did.
Hmm.
I went and visited those a couple of years ago. Ironically, I was there on the weekend that October 7th happened,
Mm.
2 years ago. And that's another place that's really working to keep those stories,
To
the
keep the
real stories
story time.
and the real
Yeah,
names
man.
and the names of the oppressed and the enslaved alive and keeping the stories that the museum. Have you been to the Legacy Museum?
I haven't actually gone there. I was a part of a project where they're, trying to erect monuments where lynching has
Hmm.
occurred. So I've
Yeah,
been a part of like the extension work
gotcha.
that they're doing, which is really, really important because
Yeah.
in Florida I think had one of the highest lynching rates. So that you can't mark it
No.
every mile, but
Yeah.
but it is to remember and to hear those stories so that then we could hopefully work on not repeating them. I don't know what that looks like in today's day and age where we do have what we were talking to in regards to Colombia. We
Yeah.
do have governance, and this is why it's so dangerous, where you do have governance, legal precedent being set that is saying that you cannot share and tell these stories. DEI, you cannot have a discussion about what the impact is on or acknowledge that people have a diverse experience,
Right.
something completely different than what you've experienced that we need to talk about so that we can see what the impact of those experiences are. Because when we do that, we are elevating ourselves as humanity, right?
Right.
To eliminate the things that are harmful, that keep us down, that keep us from progressing. I always talk about that in the United States because you had so much racism and prejudice and all of that, the folks who were actually having the knowledge to move things forward, you were saying don't matter. And imagine if they did matter and had the resources, how much far further advanced we would be if we used indigenous technology for our food sourcing, for our
Right.
health, for our bodies, for our medical care. If we actually use these things and have them as a part of our lexicon of knowledge, we would be so much more advanced. And technology is causing a challenge with that, because even though this narrative is happening, you got young people that are online and saying, I learned this today in school, but this is what I know because,
Right.
I
Yeah.
saw something on my algorithm that gives a different perspective. And I'm actually much more interested in this perspective and hearing from these folks. And I love that. I love that about how we're advancing and being able to really challenge these things different from what happened in the past. That's speaking into what you were talking about earlier.
Well, I loved your point about the difference between the development of thought and the furthering of thought versus the programming. You know,
Mhm.
the
Yes.
memorization of facts and figures and names and places. And when I was going through all of my schooling way long ago, I
Not that
was
long.
I was still very propagandized. I did
Hmm.
not understand the concept of narrative and who was telling the story, and that if it's coming through the lens of the winner, then how much are we not hearing about the
Yes.
people that were destroyed and in whatever conflict we were learning about. And so if I went through, I used to teach this to my daughter. I think I've mentioned this before, when she was little, and she would watch commercials. There was one particular product. It was called Floam, and it was this
Hmm.
material that was kind of like Play-Doh, but it was
Okay.
marketing itself as, the next step up from Play-Doh. And it was like came in this kind of weird dot form, and you can make things with it just like Play-Doh. And she wanted Floam, man. She wanted it so badly. And she finally got it for Christmas that year, and that was the only thing she wanted to play with. She got lots of other things, but Floam was the only thing she wanted to play with. So she's at the table. She's like 4 years old, and she's at the table and she's playing with this Floam, and it's not living up to what the commercial
Oh.
suggested it would
Uh-oh.
do. She was like, "Well, I'm trying to do this and it's not doing that. And I don't like this stuff," and her 4-year-old or 5-year-old in righteous indignation because what she's playing with is not what she thought it was going to be. And we sat down and had a conversation. She's like, "It's different than what they said," and all of this. And I said, "Well, yeah, because they created a commercial that was only geared towards making you want to get Floam. It was
That
not
is it.
necessarily truthful about what the product was necessarily going to be like when you actually got it, because once you pay for it, they don't care if you don't like it, and they don't care if you throw it
Hmm.
away. You got
Capitalism
your money, and
and
that's the point.
propagandizing.
So
Yeah,
we
man.
always had that conversation as she was growing up. Consider the source, consider the source.
Hmm.
Who's telling you the story as
Yeah.
to what are they trying to get you to believe? I did not have that growing up, and
Hmm.
and and didn't even really develop it. I didn't have that critical eye toward propaganda that you might hear in the news or that you might, read in certain places. I was still waking up to that, and have only just recently, in the past like 8 years, woken up to that. So I love that point about the difference between, if we want our universities to be places where, and this is kind of how they advertise themselves, but it's not necessarily what they end up being. If we want them to be where our young and upcoming humans come to expand their horizons, expand their
Yes,
mind,
that is
and
it.
and develop new ways of looking at the world, then that's wonderful. But if we're wanting them only to be places to feed the propaganda, and I think that's what myself and many thousands of others of people in the past 2 years especially have woken up
Hmm.
to, the university's role in the
Hmm.
propaganda of
Very well.
narrative about a land and about a history and about how a country dominates, and just the interweavings of the Zionist mindset into Columbia University and also into many other top universities, because that's where the support is, and just the propagandization of the
Done.
students, as well as people that grow up in the Jewish faith, who grow up in Zionist households, who are propagandized into that Zionist way of thinking. It's not about Judaism, it's about Zionism. So
Zionism.
So I think we should
And
all think,
Zionism goes back to that linkage of like hierarchies of
yeah,
like white supremacy
white
with like
supremacy.
and that's what we're like really literally seeing the parallels. And
Hmm.
that's what is particularly dangerous. It's
Yes,
particularly dangerous in the institutions that hold a lot of power. It's something that you said, and I just want to bring your attention to it. Those who won, and there's a difference between winning and difference between taking and
yes,
assuming power
right.
and then pushing the narrative.
Yes.
So I just want to check in. As I don't know about winning, but you
It's
did
not about
take
winning.
power. Yeah, you did take power
Thank you
and you
for
did
that check.
oppress and you did push a narrative. And
Yeah,
you're not winning because you're still in harm. You're still looking over your shoulder. You're still have to fight for your positionality and you still have to live in fear. That's not winning in my understanding of winning.
no,
Understanding winning for me is peace and ease, joy, being able to communicate, being able to learn, which is what we want our educational institutions to be,
yes,
because the only way that we advance is through challenging what it already exists. That is research. That is science. That is, you gave me something, let me expand it. And I expand it by challenging it. I repeat it, but I also add like other components of it to see exactly how it's going to shift and move. And if we're thinking about things scientifically, if we're doing it from um, the most effective and intelligent way to go around gathering knowledge, then we're not doing it in a way where we're limiting our understanding
mm,
and we're limiting what we have resource to do and to explore.
yeah. Thank you for that check. I appreciate that because you're right. That would have been the mindset of the narrative that we won and they lost. But you're right. It is not, that is not. So I appreciate that check. You're
And
right.
a nice gentle way of doing it.
Yes, you had a lovely way of doing it. Thank you, my friend.
Why do I give a fuck? Why do
Thanks for
I
joining
give a
us.
fuck?
Until next time,
Why
as you
do I
move
try
throughout
so
your day,
hard? Why am I
continue to
so
ask yourself,
attached? Why do I give a
Why Do I
fuck?
Give a Fuck
Why do
is
I
produced in
give a fuck?
collaboration with Johanna and
Why
Diane.
do I
Music
try so
by
hard?
Norwegian
Why do I
musician
care so
Water.
much?
See you next time.
Why do I